Well, welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 15 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Deeper Magic from Before the Dawn of Time. All right, so we ended on quite a sour note last time, but we're feeling a lot better, right, Phil?
We sure are. I've had a little time to recover.
Yeah, and we have a special guest with us today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Anna.
Hello, Anna.
Anything you want to share about yourself?
I am married to Daniel,
Okay.
and it's an honor to be here.
Yeah, this is really, really fun. We're looking forward to this chapter. You had told me that you were really interested when Phil and I first started doing this podcast. Anna was like, I really want to do chapter 15. Or I think you just said like the chapter where Aslan is resurrected.
Wow, spoiler.
That's true. Was there any reason in particular you were really interested in this chapter?
I mean, there's a lot of hope in this chapter, and it's really fun. And I think we'll get to some more of that later of why I love it so much.
Yeah, great.
I don't want to spoil anything.
Exactly, yeah. We understand. Although we kind of play this game where we try not to move ahead, but I would love to know if there actually are any listeners who are like going along with us for the first time. I have to assume that we're kind of just doing this as kind of a fun way for us to, travel through this book. But I'm assuming everyone actually has read the book and is keeping up with us. What do you think, Phil?
I think there has to be at least one person who has never read the books and just got hooked, and they're listening to the summary each time and finding out stuff.
Yeah.
And we would love for you to contact us and prove my theory.
It's really just Phil at this point that probably is the only person who hasn't moved ahead.
Well, I haven't. I mean, it's been a really long time since I'd read this book, so I had forgotten a lot of the really crucial details. I mean, I remembered liking this chapter. I remembered, the premise of the chapter, but I didn't remember any of the details, so it was really lovely to go back and read it.
Oh. Another thing I've noticed is I think that by the time we finish this season of the podcast, we'll have read this book 3 times minimum.
Oh, at least.
But not reading all the way through 3 times. We've read every chapter 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I usually read a couple of times beforehand just to make sure I really have it, especially when I'm the one doing the chapter summary like I am today. So are we ready to jump into
transition, yeah.
Let's
go. All right, so here's chapter 15. As Aslan lies dead on the stone table, the witches' armies leave the hilltop to prepare for battle. Susan and Lucy grieve over Aslan's body. They take off the muzzle around his mouth, but are unable to untie the tight cords around him. As the night goes on, small mice appear and begin chewing the knots, eventually leaving Aslan untied. The girls decide to walk around the hill, but just as dawn is arriving, they hear an enormous crack. They return to the hilltop to find the stone table split in two and Aslan standing next to the table. He tells the girls that the witch had forgotten the deeper magic. Because of his sacrifice, death itself is working backwards. The girls frolic with Aslan around the hill before he lets out a deafening roar. Susan and Lucy climb on Aslan's back and ride with him to the witch's castle.
Well done.
And I hit the perfect 150 words. I had to take out a couple of pronouns there and mix some stuff around. It was kind of like playing a fun game. What are some things that stood out to y'all before we kind of start breaking down the chapter? What are some quick takeaways?
One thing I noticed is we have a very, very low point where they're crying so much that they can't cry anymore, and then they do cry more. But you also have a real high point when they're riding on Aslan, and he's right before that he's running around having them chase him. So it's just this is a big turning point in the book.
Did you have a takeaway, Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of echo that. There's 2 very strong emotions throughout, or feelings throughout the chapter. It's joy and sorrow, and that juxtaposition the juxtaposition reinforces both. You can't really feel the joy at the end of the chapter without really knowing the depth of the sorrow that they felt at the beginning.
That's good.
Mm.
I think my big takeaway was, I had 2. One was really interesting in that this is probably the most pivotal chapter of the book. I mean, there literally is a pivot here in which the whole story revolves. But this chapter probably has the least amount of things happening, and it takes place over the shortest amount of time. I mean, we're going from the middle of the night till morning. And that's it. I guess at the very end, they do travel to the witch's castle, but that's just the very last paragraph or so.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very short time span, and even pages wise, this is a shorter chapter. Yet it's so incredibly important. The second thing that stood out to me is there's a clear sense of emotion and atmosphere here. Lewis uses a lot of emotional language in this chapter, and I think he also really uses light to symbolize the way that the girls are kind of moving through their grief and the hope that is slowly coming. So I definitely, as we go through here, I want to break down a couple of the times that C.S. Lewis talks about light. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to go ahead and read the beginning of the chapter here. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For with wild cries and a noise of skirkling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs. And overhead there were a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. So we start this chapter off in just as bad of a place as we left Susan and Lucy. I mean, it's just continuing kind of that really bad space. Do y'all feel that?
I do, yeah.
It's almost like, we've approached this in a very serialized format, reading each chapter at a time. And the last couple of chapters, there's been kind of a hard pivot at the beginning of each chapter. From, chapter 13, it was just very tense. Chapter 14 was one of just despair. And then 15 just continues that. There's not any atmospheric change here in Lewis's writing. We just continue on. And this is literally picking up the moment after the last chapter ended. So you can kind of tell we're right here at the climax of the book because the chapters are just flowing one into the other. Any other takeaways from that passage?
I think there's an interesting contrast with the witch, who is so confident and kind of at a high point in her own story. And then, that's going on and they rush past the children who are at such a low point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in general, Lewis does a great job, painting a picture. Like his imagery is really great. Mm-hmm. When I read this when I read this passage, I really feel, like you were saying, Daniel, I really feel the darkness. I really feel like I'm like there. I'm not really sure what minotaurs are. Do you guys know what minotaurs are?
Yeah,
they're like small tars.
That's what they are. They're mini tars. No, just kidding. For listeners, Anna is such a gracious wife, and although she is quite nerdy, she doesn't necessarily take it to the level of Phil and I, and so you've been really good sport about this.
I guess you could explain it this way. Minotaurs, in a lot of cases, are amazing.
In Greek mythology, do I need to explain it?
Yeah, you got to explain it now.
In Greek mythology, I think it's Greek mythology, minotaurs were found at the end of a maze. That's why they're amazing.
Oh, but what are they?
They're half man, half bull.
Oh, okay.
Am I right? Isn't that right?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's what because I have the is it Pauline Baines? Pauline Baines?
Yeah, that's the illustrator.
Mm-hmm, that you guys always talk about that Phil doesn't know.
We have a listener.
I have her illustration here, and it does look like, it's like a bull head in a human's body.
They're kind of, and some of the stuff we've also found, she doesn't necessarily depict exactly what C.S. Lewis is writing, but they're pretty terrifying illustrations there.
Yeah, they are. And all of the things, including them, now that I know what a minotaur is, that's helpful. But the fact that there's like anything you could imagine that is dark and evil kind of like flowing around there is interesting, especially bats. I'm not a fan of bats myself, so that sounds terrifying. The giant bats.
Yeah, and I love the alliteration too, a flurry of foul wings. And then not alliteration, but the blackness of vultures and giant bats. It's just some very scary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It is, and we leave kind of that, they leave and Susan and Lucy are left there, and they're just as hopeless as they are scared.
Mm-hmm.
So, they go to Aslan, they take off his muzzle, they try to untie the cords, but they can't. And while they're doing that, there's a line that C.S. Lewis writes where they talk about the muzzle, and he writes, "So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded." So they're able to get the muzzle off, but I really want to start talking about light and dark, because I hadn't noticed this before, but as I was reading this yesterday and then today as well, I was realizing C.S. Lewis often talks about light in this chapter. I mean, there's really clear connections we can draw between, like, the good and the light and the bad and the dark kind of thing, which is very clearly here in this book. But even from the start, so we're on just like the second page or third page of the chapter, we're seeing that it's here at their moment of most despair, it's the darkest part of the night.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then very shortly after, it was the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. And that's like very shortly after. And then, like, as things start to get better throughout the chapter, it does get lighter, like you were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, that's just like the 2 paragraphs down. It starts to get a little bit better. So we're definitely going to keep unpacking that. What happens next?
Well, after
Mice.
yeah. The mice definitely, yeah. So right after that with the muzzle, it's coming to probably one of my favorite parts of the chapter, which sounds a little weird, and we haven't really talked about this yet. Y'all have talked about it in the past, but just the change of perspective here for a second, where C.S. Lewis's voice kind of enters in.
Mm-hmm.
The part where it says, well, in my book, it's at the bottom of 173, "I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night." It's very tough to read because he describes how miserable they were, how sad they were. But I think it serves a couple of different purposes. He breaks the fourth wall, obviously, which draws the reader in. But he gives the reader an idea of how they're feeling, which, if this book, I first encountered this book when I was a child. It kind of reminds me of, if someone is reading a story to you. I don't know if y'all do, but whenever I read to kids, a lot of times, especially younger kids, even if it's a picture book, I'll stop and I'll say, he was really sad, like you were really sad yesterday, when you fell and you skinned your knee and it was really hard and it hurt, to kind of help illustrate that. And it also kind of helps the reader empathize with Susan and Lucy. He's like, I hope you haven't been really sad, but if you've been really sad and you've cried and you felt like you had no more tears left, there was a sort of quietness. And I just found that passage really, really moving.
Yeah, absolutely. What I love about that is, even if you haven't felt that, he still goes on to describe it.
Exactly.
And so you still understand, like, okay, so this is more sad than I've ever been before. But if you have felt it, it still works for you. So, like, he kind of covered everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me as we've gone through this whole season of reading the book is that every time C.S. Lewis breaks the fourth wall, it's done to draw you deeper in, not to take you out. I mean, there's different, approaches, especially with comedy. Often you think about like movies or television. If they break the fourth wall, it's usually it's supposed to be like a splitting away from the narrative or from that, the structure of whatever you're watching. This, I think, does like the opposite of that, and it draws you deeper into the story. And I'd love to, as we go along with these books, see is that a thing that just is able to happen because we're in a more dramatic kind of place? Is that because literature allows that? Like, or is that just C.S. Lewis as a writer that is able to kind of latch onto your emotions and draw you in? But it's definitely different than when I think of something like, Arrested Development or, a TV show that breaks the fourth wall. It never brings me more, and it pushes me further away. But that's the point,
It's because he's doing it in a very, like I said, a very like storyteller kind of way. Like you were saying, in TV shows, a lot of times when they break the fourth wall, it's more like trying to be meta. Like, is this real? Like, art is a lie. Nothing is real. Like, it's, kind of stuff like that. Like more performance art. And C.S. Lewis is saying, y'all, they were really, really upset and they felt no hope. Here's how it was. I don't know. It feels like he's kind of ushering you, like you said, deeper into the story.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of is the Princess Bride when the grandfather's reading to the kid.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
It's just like C.S. Lewis is right there and going, well, have you ever felt so sad that you couldn't cry anymore?
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
Oh, that's a good connection.
So then the mice show up after the girls are not able to untie the cords around Aslan. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book here. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. So here again, we have light and the fact that it's illuminating the girls' faces. It's definitely lighter than it was before. And we even have kind of the mice coming to the rescue. And it's, you know, the beautiful depiction of here's a great lion, the great cat, as the witch calls him, right? Being freed of these cords by little mice. And there's actually, we can't get too much into this because it would be moving forward, but there's a great payoff as to a gift that Aslan gives to the mice later on because of their kindness here in freeing him. Do either of y'all know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't remember.
Okay, that's
so
fine.
that'll be fun. So weird.
We gotta wait till another book.
Oh man.
Another book?
I think it's in the next
I've
book.
read this book the most out of the whole series, so yeah, there's not a chance that I remember that then.
It's like, what is he talking about?
Yeah. Any other takeaways from that little passage?
Go ahead.
You go ahead.
No, yours is probably. I was just gonna talk about how I don't like critters, but I don't want to create any enemies. I've already said I don't like bats.
I don't think we have a lot of bat listeners and critter listeners.
I know some people really love mice, and I just feel like they're gross. I would have had the same reaction.
One thing I noticed is how Lucy. We know that she's the smallest. Even among the beavers, she's like the smallest person. I think she just has a different perspective, and her different perspective here brings her closer to the mice, where she can see what they're doing. And I also just love the way that she talks about them. She goes, "I think they're friendly mice." She just has like a very different kind of perspective on what their motives may be, I guess. Maybe she isn't as aware of like the horrors of the world or something, but she doesn't assume the same thing that Susan does.
I mean, that's definitely been Lucy's character through and through throughout the book. And it's nice because I feel like, we spent so much of this book with Lucy in the first, 6, 7, 8 chapters. And then we really haven't spent a lot of time with her. We focused on Peter and Edmund. We focused on Aslan and the witch. It's really nice to have Lucy kind of come back these last 2 chapters in such a large role because, I mean, she's my favorite character in the book for sure. And it's not even naive. That sounds too pejorative for her. She's innocent, right? Yeah. And I think even just her being a little bit younger than Susan kind of expects the worst from these mice at first, and Lucy's like, wait.
I mean, Lucy is the epitome, just to kind of draw these things back to the Bible. I feel like it's the epitome of what Jesus meant when he said, "Let the little children come to me." I'm trying to figure out I know the word. I feel like I know the word that you're looking for. It's not naive. It's this like childlike, I don't know, joy.
Innocence?
Well, innocence,
no
but
one likes
no,
my
it's
word.
deeper. No, I mean, innocence is just like, it's not a bad word, but it's like not, it doesn't encapsulate the meaning that we're,
true.
Trying to get at here. It's this joy and this, like how children, they see more than meets the eye, which is exactly what's going on.
Transformers?
No.
I didn't hear anything you said. All of now I'm thinking about is Optimus Prime.
I was reinforcing your point, Phil.
I know.
Good. Nice point.
And then as we keep traveling along the text, we get to another sentence, which is, as the light grew and they could see it better. So they're talking about Aslan. Sorry, I should have read the whole thing. It says, every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew and they could see it better. So again, more and more hope is coming as the night is going on and the morning is quickly approaching. And I'd never picked up on this stuff before. And then you skip down just a little bit more to the very next paragraph, and it says, "It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night." And so I've really loved kind of seeing the way that C.S. Lewis is transitioning us through this grief to the hope that's ahead.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, Phil, do you want to read what happens next after the girls go for a little walk?
This part is right after Lucy says that she's cold, and Susan says that she is too, and they decide to walk around for a bit. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm, and oh, how tired their legs felt. Then, at last, as they stood for a moment looking out towards the sea in Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment, they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate.
So is it like a loud crash? Is it a deep... I'm trying to imagine what a giant breaking a giant's plate sounds like.
It's like you ever broken a plate before?
No.
Well, it's loud.
Okay, go grab a plate.
No.
Yeah, let me go down the kitchen. I mean, it's...
I think it would be like a loud crash, but if it's a giant's plate, I imagine everything would be thicker, and it would just be like a much deeper sound,
Sure,
much more powerful sound, like the kind that kind of like forcibly moves you when you hear it.
Very loud shatter.
Yeah.
I also like how in that passage again, I mean, I sound like a broken record, but with the there's a big focus on the sun coming up here.
Yeah, that's the part that stood out to me, the part that I underlined. The red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met. It's just a whole lot of connection to, the overall, like the light coming in multiple ways.
So the two girls rush back to the stone table, and what do they see?
I'm drum rolling.
Oh.
This is like when no one was paying attention in class.
That's why I'm used to it. I can wait out the long pauses forever.
I'm asleep.
Yeah. You repeat the question?
Okay. So the two girls, they hear this deafening, cracking sound, and then they run back to the stone table to find what?
The rising of the sun had made everything look so different, and there was no Aslan.
And it's the rising of the sun in a couple of ways, right?
Exactly. I think that's a pretty clear symbolism there. And the stone table itself has been split in half. And then we see, I love this, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had ever seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. So again, this is like so much of this is related to the light. Again, I mean, that's literally my only note for this whole chapter pretty much is, hey, there's a lot of stuff to do with light and dark.
Yeah. It's like as soon as the sun kind of appears over the horizon, then you hear the crack. And then if you ever watch a sunrise, it happens so fast. Like it kind of takes a while to get started, but then as soon as the sun appears, it's like almost instantly, from a distance, it appears to be several feet above the horizon within a few seconds. And now it's like backlighting Aslan, which is really cool. Definitely like a hero shot moment.
Yeah, and it's really cool in the movie. I thought they actually did that really well.
I look forward to that.
Yeah. It's a really cool thing, and I think there's also a lot of just, small symbolism here with, who is it that sees Aslan after he's resurrected?
I mean, that actually is a nice segue into another reason why this is probably my favorite chapter of the book. Just the fact, I mean, so clearly, not just the resurrection, right, but even the crucifixion of Jesus. You have women being explicitly named, which is a huge deal in the Bible anytime women are explicitly named. I won't go into the like nitty-gritty historical context stuff, but in that time, in that particular society, for women to be named at all was pretty significant. And the fact that in all of the Gospels, we have at least the Marys mentioned at the crucifixion, and sometimes at the burial, and then always, you know, a lot of times, the Bible will have like a little subtitle, the resurrection morning, which I think is really lovely. The fact that, you know, here we have Lucy and Susan basically being like the Marys.
Sure.
They witness like the deep sorrow and pain in seeing their Savior die, and then, you know, in some cases finding the empty tomb, the empty table. I mean, there's so many crazy parallels there.
And to be honest, I think that's such a great connection. But I think after that, I think that's where the symbolism kind of stops. So this is like, I don't know, like so as we go into this, Aslan then tells, you know, why this has happened. And I think this is where it goes back from, we've gotten pretty actually allegorical in a lot of these things. And I think where we go back to
the table literally has the old law on it.
Yeah,
whereas,
exactly.
You know, the curtain tore, which was like the symbol of the old covenant.
Yes. I mean, I think that stuff is pretty kind of, there is almost not quite, but there is almost like a one-for-one symbolism there. But then Aslan gives us, he tells the girls what's happened, because like Lucy's like, wait, is he a ghost? And you know, he just says like, do I look it? You know, and
which Jesus does that too.
Yeah, I mean, but then I think we kind of turn, you know, things go a little bit the other way as Aslan explains what has happened, and I'm going to just read that here. And I've tried so hard to avoid reading as Aslan this entire time. We haven't done many character voices in a while because it's too daunting of a task. But we just have to read this, so bear with me. But what does it all mean? Asked Susan when they were somewhat calmer. It means, said Aslan, that though the witch knew the deep magic, there was a magic deeper still which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back, into the stillness and the darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who has committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backward. Any thoughts about this kind of complicated passage as we hear about the deep and deeper magic?
Yeah, while this might not be, you know, a word for word with the gospel, right? But we can all kind of see, like C.S. Lewis makes it very palatable here, you know, especially for children, that a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead. I mean, that's pretty easy to understand, right? That's what Aslan did. That's what Jesus did.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's digestible for children. I think it's something we can kind of go. You could be reading this book to a 5-6-year-old and be able to explain some very, very basic tenets of the gospel and things that we could kind of, that a kid be able to understand.
Right. But he's also strategically left out certain things. For example, it doesn't take him 3 days to rise again. He doesn't rise on the third day.
Exactly, which is a kind of a clear, like, oh, okay, this isn't, you know, and this is why, I mean, we've had listeners, and there's a lot of people who read these books. If you don't have a Christian background, at all, you might be completely unaware of these things. And that's why, for me, like, you know, reading as a kid, my parents don't even know if, like, as my mom was reading it, I think Emily talked about it, that my mom would, you know, read it with us. I don't even think she ever said the first time, like, oh, this is an allegory, or this is a supposal for Jesus. I think we just clearly picked up on it because we kind of had grown up in that environment. But if you don't have that, you're not growing up in that environment, you might not be able to pick up on that quite as clearly.
Which could be too. I mean, whenever, I don't know if y'all feel like this too, whenever I am watching a movie or having a conversation with someone who is not a believer in Jesus, it is really cool to hear them grapple with that kind of theme.
We tricked you. We got him.
Well, no, I mean, more so it's like, this is crazy that Aslan didn't do anything wrong, and yet he was slain by the witch
Yeah.
to save Edmund, who was kind of a little butthead.
Hey,
A little
we are a
smart.
G-rated podcast in here, Anna Catherine.
I can't believe she said that.
Listeners, we apologize. That was completely uncalled for.
Am I
Here comes
alone?
the explicit label.
Yeah. So let's keep moving on past this, and we get to a really fun section, which I know Anna was really excited to read. So do you want to share that?
Yeah. So it's very shortly after that when Aslan is saying he feels his strength coming back to him. This is a little lower down that page. All right. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his beautiful and huge velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled together in a happy laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind.
Oh, that last part's really great. And that's kind of the whole, like, of course he isn't safe, but he's the king. Like, it's literally like, are you playing with a kitten or playing with a thunderstorm? That's so really well written.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just love the joy in that passage. It just really, it brings to life like the incredible deep sorrow that we were talking about earlier. That C.S. Lewis kind of brings you into, and kind of as the reader you really empathize. You're like there with Lucy and Susan, and then it's like they're literally playing and rolling over and laughing and romping. I love that. I wish that we more seriously use the word romp in our everyday language.
I mean, you can.
I mean, I can, right? Let's romp around. I think it's really great. And I can just really picture that. And I think, just seeing this joy, we can't really feel that joy without feeling the sorrow that we felt earlier, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It does.
And then it kind of changes again. So they have that playfulness, and then Aslan roars, and the girls can't even look at his face because it became so terrible. So again, you have that kind of juxtaposition of this, Aslan is terrible and strong and not safe, but then he's also, he's regal and he's playful, right? It really makes Aslan such an interesting character.
Yeah, I just love that. He's all of those things. It's like y'all were saying, like, how is he terrible and playful, all those things at the same time. I just love that he comes to them. I mean, Aslan is such a great character, obviously. I'm a fan. But he comes to them in a way that he speaks to them in their language, right? Like they're children, so he plays with them. That's the first thing he does.
I also love the smooth transition where they're just kind of rolling around, laughing, having a good time, and he goes, and now to business.
Right.
I think I'm going to roar now.
Oh, yeah.
So after all that's done, they hop on Aslan's back, and they ride. I guess you still say ride, even though he's a lion, right? They ride on his back to the witch's castle. Excuse me. To the witch's castle. And I mean, I guess just to kind of stay consistent throughout this season, I'm very unclear of how far away the witch's castle is.
Yeah, that was actually what I thought about when I was reading this chapter, because y'all keep talking about that, and I was like, oh, I've never really considered, where is her?
When you look at the maps, it doesn't look like the stone table is close to the castle. So what I'm imagining happens here is Aslan is using some kind of magic to get them there faster than they should get there.
Well, and kind of along, like, going further here, we've got another time where C.S. Lewis's voice comes in again, where he is breaking the fourth wall. Like, have you ever had a gallop on a horse?
It's like that, but then get rid of the noise.
Right. Then imagine, like, you're not riding on a road or in a park or even on the downs. Do y'all know what the downs are?
He's talking about just the English countryside.
Oh, okay. That sounds so lovely.
I think. I don't know. We're city dwellers. We don't really know.
Right. Well, I mean, I know what the countryside is, but I'm from a more rural area, listeners, but not the English countryside. Probably like
Obviously.
the opposite of the English countryside.
I do love. I marked a little part where every time there's some description of the location or
Yeah.
like the order of events, like for example, in here they go past tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar, then smaller streams, then larger, and then swimming the largest of all. Every time I see something like that, and then later on, like glades of oak, wild orchards, snow white cherry trees, roaring waterfalls, mossy rocks, I always mark it because I think that would help Daniel make a map of Narnia.
Yeah.
The
It helps me-
shoulders of heathery mountains. I don't even know what that means.
It-
Giddy ridges makes a little more sense. Acres of blue flowers is pretty clear. Those are poppies.
I mean, it definitely helps me picture it more. I don't know if it helps me figure out how close things are, like the geography of the land. But I think again, we've talked about this since, I don't know, probably the first or second chapter. This is not. I think one of the mistakes we often make is saying, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were close friends, and therefore all of their stuff should be the same. Where Tolkien has this very, his world is very much consistent throughout. I mean, you go all the way from its founding, and you talk about like Era Luvatar, all the way through the Third Age and the Lord of the Rings, and things kind of like fall in line, and it feels like a lived-in world. Narnia doesn't necessarily have that. Even each book is very different. It's 7 distinct stories, where like the Lord of the Rings is one overarching, story, and I think that's okay. And so one of the things I've kind of come to grips with, I guess, is that like this land doesn't have to be this kind of thing I can put right on a map and be like, oh, this is where everything is. This is where the Gap of Rohan is, and this is where Isengard and Fangorn Forest are. I'd be like, no, like we don't really have all that stuff. Like this is a magical land. And maybe it's even the case that some of these things are, not like traditional, like geographic places like we envision them here in our world,
Right.
And I'm becoming more and more okay with that. So as they get to the witch's home, they have this, all of the gates they're fastened shut, and there's these really tall walls. And I'm going to read the very last paragraph of the chapter as the two girls and Aslan get inside the castle. Next moment, the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them. For the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had yet made, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. And that's what we'll end for today. Any last thoughts before we wrap up this chapter?
Things are looking up.
Literally. Did you have any thoughts, Anna, about this chapter before we ask you some questions?
Oh, there are going to be questions for me?
You didn't study?
No. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of alluded to this. Listeners, I am a big-time feeler. I have a lot of feelings and emotions. I'm actually in school to be a counselor. Spoiler for everyone. So that's a big part of who I am and how I interact with this book, is the feelings. And so I just really feel like, with the joy and with the sorrow, for me as a kid and me as an adult, reading through this chapter really does help me connect better with the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that about C.S. Lewis does an incredible job of drawing us in to Lucy and Susan's sorrow, which draws me deeper into the sorrow that I feel when Jesus is crucified. But then also on the flip side, the joy that we feel as Lucy and Susan play with the resurrected Aslan.
Do you envision the two Marys and Jesus like playing tag in the courtyard? Like, hey, you guys want to play tag?
Actually, I know this is not a word for word, but I always think about, it wasn't the Marys, right? When they have breakfast with Jesus. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? I think it's at the end of John. And it's when Peter gets the opportunity.
If you're wrong,
know.
someone will let us know. Don't
Right,
worry.
right,
Someone
right.
will email us.
It's, when Jesus is asking Peter, feed my sheep, all that. I think, food was a huge part of their culture. Food is a huge part of my culture, too. So I kind of feel like the playing to children is as eating is to adults. You know what I mean?
I like that. Yeah.
It's like, let's do something like before. That's true. Like before Jesus, quote unquote, got down to business, they had breakfast.
Right.
Because it's the
Daniel, I don't think they would play tag because they would get close to Jesus and he would be like, "Don't touch me.
Oh,
I
that's
have not
right.
yet
Yeah, he
ascended
hasn't gone back up
to
to
the
heaven."
Father."
I'm glad you said that because we would have gotten an email on that too.
Oh, for sure.
Although we do appreciate and love our emails, so we really don't mind being corrected. I'm just trying to save y'all some time. So Anna, before we let you go, we have 2 questions we've asked everyone on their first visit by our podcast here. And the first question I have for you is, what is your favorite book in the Narnia series? Anna, just so listeners know, she's looking at the back of the book right now.
It's been okay. So it's been such a long time.
She's looking at the books on the back of the book.
No, it's been such a long time since I've read this. Since I read the series, I was a big fan. I was a huge reader when I was a kid, and series were my favorites. I read a lot of series. I was a big Anne of Green Gables fan, just so everyone knows. I really enjoyed this book. But I think
they can't see which
the
one you're
lion.
pointing to.
This book, the one that we are talking about.
Okay.
I really do enjoy this book. I do remember really liking The Magician's Nephew too.
Yeah.
So
You don't have to apologize for that. It's great.
I really, really didn't like The Horse and His Boy.
We got some listeners that really like it.
I know. And I'm trying to remember what I didn't like about it. I think I thought it was boring.
That's
so
fair.
maybe which I realized that one of the other guests, Sarah Jane, who's actually like one of my best friends, really, that has kind of caused some tension. We never talked about the fact that she really loved that book.
That's why we were
and
actually,
I thought it was really boring.
We were actually
That's why we're having you on separate
Exactly.
episodes.
You guys were going to come on at the same time. We're like, well, they can't. They just feel so differently about The Horse and His Boy, it'll get ugly.
She probably remembers it better than I do.
Or maybe she just doesn't like, maybe you don't like good things, or maybe she doesn't like good things. Maybe it's deeper than that.
Maybe she's boring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually, Horse and His Boy is my least favorite too. So, oops.
Oh, okay.
But at least I've read them all. So.
I've read all of them.
No, I'm talking about Phil. All right. So this is your favorite.
I'm working on it.
Are you interested in? Cause we'd love to have you on again. Are you going to plan on reading any more as an adult, or is this kind of like I kind of want to follow along with us as we're going through? Because you're actually a listener of this. You're like our first listener, really.
Right. When I finish graduate school, I really do want to reread.
Yeah.
More. I've enjoyed rereading some of this book so far. It's been really great.
Did you read all of the book to get here, or are you just reading like a couple of chapters? Like, have you reread the whole book of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
I've reread pieces of it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
You've been kind of busy.
Yeah.
And you're nice enough after I've just begged you 1,000 times to come on the show to do it. The second question we've been asking people is, what is your relationship to these books? So, like, did you grow up with them? I know we kind of grew up in different types of households. And so is this something that, like, y'all were reading as kids? Was it something you just read on your own? Tell us.
I was definitely reading it as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I remember teachers reading it to us.
Okay.
Like, read aloud in class when I was
Do you remember what grade?
pretty young. Probably 2nd or 3rd grade.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, I know...
Were all the grades all together in the same room?
No, I'm not from that rural of an area.
Well, you mentioned Anne of Green Gables, and like I was just thinking,
yeah. Well, I just love Anne of Green Gables. Yeah.
when you practice writing, did you have to stick the pencil in the fire to get enough charred?
Yes, Phil. I
Dust.
did. I did. Yeah. And my quill, and
Oh, like in Harry Potter?
Yes. Which
That's awesome.
Interestingly enough, though, I realize this can be kind of controversial in some places, but I had teachers who, like, I had a teacher, I think my 3rd grade teacher read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe aloud, and one of the first Harry Potter book aloud to us.
Oh.
Don't tell her name. I don't want her to get in trouble.
I won't. But I do remember that. So I had that relationship. And then also, like I mentioned, I was a big reader as a kid, and I especially loved series of books. So I really like to kind of get, in the story and the reoccurring nature of it.
Like Animorphs?
Oh,
no, actually, I
man.
was not into Animorphs. Sorry. I feel like I don't know if it was after my time. I don't know. I read a lot of old books because my grandma was really a really big part of my childhood. And she would literally just give me a series of books. So I think she got the entire Narnia series from a yard sale. That's how I got a lot of the books that I read. She was a big yard sailor, I guess.
Is that the word?
That was like one of her hobbies. She went like early every Saturday morning and she would scour for books and other things. And she got this whole series and she would just like give me the books to read. No, I was more of a Babysitter's Club fan, if you're talking about like the Animorphs. Aside from the classics like the Chronicles of Narnia, I read the Babysitter's Club. And Nancy Drew.
You actually bring up a good point here, which because you just you included the Chronicles of Narnia as classics. Would you say they are classics?
To me, they are. Yeah.
I think they are too. What about you, Phil?
Definitely.
But here's an interesting thing. As we've started doing this podcast, I usually, whenever I'm at a bookstore, I go check out the Lion, the Witch, or the Narnia section, just because I like to see like what different versions of the books they have. Because it's been really cool. We've had listeners even share with us like their favorite covers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, but one of the things that's been interesting is there's not usually a lot of like copies of the Narnia books, and like I go like Barnes and Noble or like Books A Million or just like local places, and I always wonder like, is it something that is? I mean, obviously Narnia is not necessarily as popular as things like, Harry Potter or The Lion, the Witch, and the Ward, or The Lord of the Ring, or The Hobbit would be the more of an equivalent.
Yeah.
Obviously not as popular, and but I would still say they're classics because how many other children's books are from like the 1950s are still around on shelves in a Barnes and Noble? You know what I mean? They definitely don't have that same kind of reach as some of those other books. You know what I mean? But you would still say they're classics?
I do. I would say, just to keep drawing the parallel, because they kind of are grouped together in my mind. Anne of Green Gables is not as, you don't find that series.
That's true, yeah.
As easily. And most people, I've talked to people before, they don't even know that Anne of Green Gables was a series. They're
What
like,
do they think it was?
Just that one book.
Oh, okay.
Just a
Yeah.
single book.
And a lot of people have just read that one. But I would also say that those are classics by Ellen Montgomery. So, I mean, I don't know, because I think, which this isn't children's books, but I have not enjoyed the Charles Dickens books that I've read as much. So I don't know if, what people define as a classic should necessarily be, the standard for what a good book is.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's subjective. That's the thing. I think they are, and I think even the fact that we're still around talking about these books, more than 50 years later, I think shows they've kind of stood the test of time. And I mean, I know that there's all kinds of stuff going on with this. They're trying to make the Silver Chair movie, and people are arguing is there even an audience for this, and all those kind of things. I think even the mere fact that a book from more than 50 years ago might potentially get a movie adaptation is still a pretty big deal. I mean, and I think they're obviously classics. I think C.S. Lewis has written. I think they're masterpieces, to be honest. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? We've gone kind of long today.
That's it on this end.
Yeah. All right. Well, listeners, you can follow us Into the Wardrobe on our Twitter or Facebook pages. If you have any feedback, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com, or you can leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. That's 406-646-6733. We'd also appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts because this helps other listeners find the show and join with us on our read-through. Also, make sure you've subscribed to the show in whatever podcast app you like to use so you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Our show's themes were created by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more of his work in the links in our episode description. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time for Chapter 16.